I didn't just lose my son 20 years ago. I became a ghost in my own family, a man erased from the history books because I couldn't afford to buy my way back into his heart. But last week, everything changed when I received a gold-embossed invitation to a Christmas dinner I wasn't supposed to be alive for, sent by the same son who told me to rot in hell 2 decades ago. And the only reason he wants me there now is because he found out I'm sitting on a $15 million fortune. Is it wrong that I'm planning to walk into that house, eat their expensive food, and then burn every bridge they think they've rebuilt? Or would you do the exact same thing if the people who abandoned you suddenly treated you like royalty the moment your bank account hit 7 figures? I need you to listen to how this started, because 20 years of silence doesn't just end with a Merry Christmas, unless there's a massive paycheck attached to the sentiment. To understand why my son Leo didn't speak to me for 2 decades, you have to understand the day the world fell apart. 20 years ago, I wasn't a rich man. I was a struggling contractor trying to keep a roof over our heads while my wife, Sarah, fought a losing battle with cancer. When she passed, the grief didn't just break me. It broke my finances. I was buried in medical debt, the house was in foreclosure, and I was working 3 jobs just to keep Leo in community college. I remember those nights clearly, coming home at 3 a.m. with grease under my fingernails, and a back that felt like it was being held together by rusty nails, only to wake up at 6 a.m. to do it all over again. I did it for him. I skipped meals so he could have textbooks. I wore the same pair of boots for 5 years until the soles were thin as paper just so he wouldn't feel the sting of our bank balance. But Leo didn't see the struggle. He saw a father who was never home, a father who couldn't afford the lifestyle his friends had, and a father who let his mother die because I couldn't afford the experimental treatments the insurance company refused to cover. He blamed me for the silence in the house and the lack of presents under the tree. He grew bitter, feeding on a diet of resentment and entitlement that I was too exhausted to notice. The day of the final blowout is burned into my brain. Leo was 21, and he told me that I was a failure of a man, that my poverty was a choice that had embarrassed him his whole life, and that he never wanted to see my face again until I had something worthwhile to offer him. He stood in that kitchen, looking at the eviction notice on the counter, and instead of offering a hand, he spat on the floor and walked out. He moved out that night, changed his number, and for 20 years, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, working in silence, while he built a life and a family I only saw through occasional, painful glimpses on social media from a distance. I watched from the digital shadows as he married a girl from a good family, bought a house with a wraparound porch, and had 2 kids who didn't even know I existed. I spent those 20 years rebuilding myself from nothing. I started a small consulting firm that eventually grew into a major construction management company. It wasn't an overnight success. It was years of sleeping in my office, years of being the first one on the job site and the last one to leave, and years of making cold calls until my voice went hoarse. I didn't do it to win him back. I did it because I had nothing else left. I had no wife to go home to and no son to call me on my birthday. Work was my only companion. I lived frugally, invested every penny, and kept my head down. I became a ghost that haunted the local business scene, a man with no past and a very profitable future. By the time I hit 60, I was worth more than I ever dreamed possible, but the money felt hollow because there was no one to share it with. I never reached out because the sting of his last words, "You're nothing to me," kept me from ever wanting to be rejected again. I lived in a state of self-imposed exile, convinced that my only value in this world was the work I produced. I assumed he was doing well. His social media was a curated gallery of luxury vacations, designer clothes, and expensive cars. But then about 3 months ago, a local business journal ran a profile on me, detailing my rags to riches story and my recent sale of the company for a staggering $15 million. I didn't think anyone I knew would see it. I was wrong. Suddenly, the silence of 20 years was broken not by a phone call, but by a frantic, overly sentimental Christmas invitation from Leo's wife, Megan. The letter was written on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil edges. It claimed that Leo has missed his father so much, and the kids deserve to know their grandfather. It talked about family being the greatest gift and how life is too short for old grudges. It was the most beautiful lie I had ever read. So that's the situation I was in. After 2 decades of being treated like I was dead, the smell of money brought me back to life in their eyes. I sat in my quiet apartment, holding that expensive piece of paper, and I realized that my son hadn't changed at all. He still only valued things that were worthwhile. I had to make a choice. Do I ignore them? Or do I go and see exactly how far they're willing to go to get their hands on my legacy? I wanted to see the look in his eyes when he realized I wasn't the broken man he left in that kitchen. Before I tell you what happened when I walked through those front doors, and what I found hidden in their festive intentions, I want you to pause and comment below. If your child had abandoned you for 20 years only to call you the moment you got rich, would you give them a second chance, or would you see right through the act? I really want to know what you would have done in my shoes before I reveal the rest of the night. Walking into that house on Christmas Eve was like stepping into a movie set where everyone was a bad actor. The driveway was lined with luxury SUVs that I knew for a fact they couldn't afford based on Leo's mid-level marketing job. The house was decorated with thousands of dollars of professional lights, and the smell of expensive catering wafted through the air. Leo hugged me, a man he hadn't spoken to since the early 2000s, as if we were best friends who had just seen each other yesterday. He squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "I've missed you, Dad," with a voice that cracked just a little too perfectly. His wife, Megan, kept commenting on my distinguished look and asking about the sale of my company before I'd even taken my coat off. She kept steering the conversation toward wealth management and legacy building under the guise of casual dinner talk. They introduced me to my grandchildren, teenagers who looked at me like I was a human ATM, asking if I was the famous grandpa from the magazine, and if I really had a private jet. It was nauseating. Every smile felt scripted. Every laugh felt rehearsed. Dinner was a parade of fake laughter and leading questions about my estate planning, and whether I had long-term investments for the family. They talked about the kids' college funds, or lack thereof, and how tough the economy had been on them lately. They were fishing, casting out lines of desperation disguised as holiday cheer, waiting for me to bite. I sat there, eating their prime rib, realizing that they had spent a fortune they didn't have just to impress me, hoping I'd pay the bill for their entire life. The climax came during dessert, when Leo pulled me into his study, a room filled with books he'd clearly never read and a mahogany desk that was mostly for show. He poured a glass of expensive scotch I knew he couldn't afford, a bottle that probably cost more than my monthly rent 20 years ago, and finally dropped the act. He didn't ask how I'd been. He didn't ask about his mother's final moments. He told me he was in deep trouble. His business was failing, they were months behind on the mortgage, and he knew his mother would have wanted me to do the right thing for her only son. He actually used his dead mother as a bargaining chip for my money, crying crocodile tears about how Mom always said you were a provider. That was the moment the last spark of fatherly love died inside me. I realized the man standing in front of me wasn't my son. He was a stranger trying to rob me with a smile. He started showing me spreadsheets of his debt, talking about how a small gift of $2 million would save his family. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had already made my decision. I told him that for 20 years, I would have given him every cent I owned just for a 5-minute phone call. I would have lived in a tent and eaten dirt if it meant he loved me for being his father. But since he waited until I was a millionaire to find his love for me, he had officially priced himself out of my life. I told him that 20 years of silence has a price, and his bank account was too empty to pay it. I stood up, walked back into the living room, and went straight to the Christmas tree. I took back the small, modest envelopes I had brought for the grandkids. Envelopes that contained $5 gift cards, a simple test they had all failed by complaining about the cheap wrapping and the lack of big boxes earlier in the night. The aftermath was explosive. The masks didn't just slip, they shattered. Leo followed me out, screaming that I was a selfish old man, that I was hoarding wealth that belonged to the family. Megan lost her sweet demeanor and called me a monster for teasing them with the hope of help after they went through the trouble of hosting me. She shouted that they had spent $5,000 on this dinner just for me, proving it was never about love. It was an investment that didn't pay off. I walked out of that house into the cold December air, the sound of their screaming fading behind the heavy oak doors, feeling lighter than I had in 2 decades. I didn't lose a son that night. I finally buried the ghost of one. I drove straight to the city and checked into a quiet hotel. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I ended up donating $3 million to the cancer center that treated Sarah, ensuring that other families wouldn't have to choose between treatment and a home. I set up a trust that will only go to local animal shelters and low-income scholarships after I'm gone. I left Leo exactly what he gave me for 20 years. Absolutely nothing. I have no regrets. The moral of this story is that blood might be thicker than water, but it's nowhere near as thick as greed. If someone doesn't want you when you're at your lowest, they don't deserve an inch of you when you've reached the top. True family is built on presence, not on potential inheritance or the size of a bank account. People will show you who they really are when they think there's something to gain. And the best thing you can do is believe them the first time they show you their back. Like this video if you think I did the right thing by walking away from that toxic dinner and refusing to be an ATM for people who didn't care if I lived or died. Subscribe for more stories about people getting exactly what they deserve and standing up for their worth. Please share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Was I too harsh for testing them? Or did they get exactly what they earned after 20 years of abandonment? I'll see you all in the next story.